And in verse 5 it says, if any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth, and devoureth their enemies. Well, I sure hate to be their enemy. Can you imagine? They just come up to you and go, and the fire just melts you.
You cursed brat! Look what you've done! I'm melting!
The only possible origin of the two witnesses. But these are two men given the office of prophet within the body of Christ.
And the fire just melts you.
That they are going to be bearing witness to God, okay? And that is their job in these end times, to give their testimony. When that job is done, when their testimony is complete,
and the fire just melts you.
So understand what their purpose is in the end times. It is to give their testimony.
Now, if any man hurt them, fire proceed out. So anybody try to do anything to them, fire gonna proceed out of their mouth.
I'm melting!
So, but now how long are they gonna be able to do this?
In Revelation 11, verse 5 and 6 says, if any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth and devoureth their enemies. Wow. Two of these powers are unique to Elijah. Two of these powers are unique to Moses.
I'm melting!
Basically, what he showed me in this dream was he showed me that the two witnesses have just come out of hiding. What I saw was these two men that had been hidden and kept secret in this, it was like a little trailer. It actually looked like one of those little U-Hauls that you can pull behind your car. I mean, they're really, really small. But in one of these were two men that had been hidden, okay? So as they were standing there, I was with some other people, I was talking to them, and I gave the one guy, his name was Russell, I gave him a huge piece of meat. I don't know why, it was just kind of a strange thing. But anyways, their names were Marshall and Russell. It actually looked like one of those little U-Hauls that you can pull behind your car. Anyways, their names were Marshall and Russell.
As you saw in Chapter 10, counter-reformationists get so obsessed over receiving special personal mystical revelatory visions, or implying their secret esoteric traditions are referenced in the Seven Thunders, they completely miss the very simple fact, Chapter 10 verses 1 through 4 was a prophecy about a coming storm. And you will see once again, this very same kind of theological behavior, when it comes to Chapter 11. Their favorite text in the whole chapter is verse 5, where it says that if anyone wishes to harm the two witnesses, fire will proceed out of their mouth, and devour their enemies. Which they take as completely and only literal, in every sense. And they are quite sure this is meant completely literal. If they don't understand anything else about Revelation, chapter 11, at all, they know this one thing for sure, literal fire is going to come out of their literal two mouths, and literally devour each of their literal enemies. And that is the one thing, they are all, absolutely certain about. Everything else may be debatable among them. But this one thing, literal fire, coming out of their literal mouths, is absolutely agreed upon, by virtually every one of them. With very rare exception, if any at all. But just as you have seen in the 10 previous chapters, we have covered in the book of Revelation, their claims are based mostly on very generalized think-blot-free associations with these texts. They very rarely ever examine the linguistic, grammatical or historical details of the text. Because if you do, you see the claims will fall apart. So instead, they simply leave the text as fast as they can, and hopscotch throughout the Bible, to fill in the blank. Chapter 11 contains two prophecies, just like you saw in chapter 10, and just like you saw in chapter 9. Verses 1 through 13 is the first prophecy, and verses 14 through 19 is the second prophecy. And neither of these two prophecies are particularly complicated prophecies. They are easy to see and interpret. If you follow the instructions John gives in the text itself, they become quite obvious and hard to miss. But missing the obvious is precisely what Counter-Reformation theology conditions the public to do. In fact, that was the whole point of the creation of Counter-Reformation theology to begin with, historically. So naturally, that is the one thing it does extremely well. Like the magician at a Vegas magic show, they use distraction and misdirection to keep the public intentionally focused on precisely the wrong thing in every single text they teach on. And chapter 11 is once again no exception. But since the series is not trying to propagate Counter-Reformation theology, we will do the three things that Counter-Reformation theology intentionally does not do when it comes to Revelation chapter 11. First, we will follow the instructions John gives in the text for interpreting this text. Secondly, we will notice the obvious things that simply cannot be missed. And thirdly, we will compare them with the details of the text's actual language and grammar, to see if we are looking at those obvious things in the correct way. If you do those three things, you will discover chapter 11 is a very simple text that really speaks for itself in history. But unfortunately, what you end up with will not look like anything you have been told by counter-reformationist preachers and theologians. Because the picture counter-reformationist preachers paint in this chapter simply does not actually exist in the text. And of course, the people who actually designed that theology for public disinformation knew that from their beginnings. So what is the real story about Revelation chapter 11 that they hide behind those intentional lies they tell the public? The real story is precisely why they decided to hide this text from the public. The real story is quite amazing on every level. But once you see what is in this text, you can see why it would become a target of disinformation by the Counter-Reformation. Because they are specifically referenced in this very text, front and center, which you are about to see right now. And it will also become clear to you when you see it, why they felt they had no choice but to keep what it reveals hidden. But before we begin going through the text and deconstructing the Counter-Reformation's cover story about Revelation chapter 11, we need to examine 4 ways which you can know they are intentionally lying to you about this text. And here is what they are intentionally hiding from you in their explanations of Revelation chapter 11. The vast majority of people spreading Counter-Reformation theology today have been simply victimized by an intentional deception and do not realize what they are doing. But the Masonic and Vatican clergy, who infiltrated their Protestant and evangelical institutions and groups decades and even centuries ago, do. And the celebrity preachers you see on your TV set every week, do. As do older seasoned ministers and academic professors in positions of prestige and authority in most of the prominent religious organizations in Western civilization. This is not a problem of ignorance, it is one of intentional deception. The spread and institutionalization of that disinformation theology is not incidental or accidental. Here, in the following 8 facts, you will see what they have intentionally hidden from you about Revelation 11. Each one of these 8 facts could on its own stand as sufficient grounds to demonstrate their claimed interpretation of this text is factually false. Each one. Certainly when you combine them together, the case becomes non-negotiable. And when you combine these 8 facts with those discussed previously in chapter 10, the case becomes inexcusable, leaving only dishonesty or ignorance to blame for their continued claims. And since the evidence is overwhelming that these things are being hidden, it is not possible to claim they are not known. Thus, it cannot be simply a result of differences of opinion. Once an intentional concealment has been exposed, you are busted. And there is nothing else that can be said about it. It becomes at that point a self-evident truth. So how do you know they are hiding something in Revelation chapter 11? And how do you catch them in the act of hiding it to expose their deceit here in this text? There are 8 points of fact you can bring up to expose their deceptions in chapter 11. The first point of fact is that verse 2 gives the time frame for John's events in chapter 11. They are clearly not at the end of the world, not at the end of time, not after a rapture, and nowhere close to where Counter-Reformation rapture theology placed these events. The second point of fact, in verse 8, the social custom described in the text itself, of leaving the bodies of hated individuals in the street, also place a dated historical context around this prophecy. The third point of fact, in verse 9, the legal, medical and funerary protocols, described in the text, also clearly date the text, and history past. The fourth point of fact, in verse 13, the earthquake itself, clearly dates the prophecy, as a relatively moderate earthquake in Jerusalem, which destroys only 1/10 of the city. The fifth point of fact, in verse 13, the demographics of Jerusalem, in the prophecy, clearly date the text, and history past. The sixth point of fact, and this is one of the most important things of all, verse 5 does not state fire comes out of the mouths of two witnesses. Despite the fact, that is precisely what you read in the English translation of the New International Standard Version. The seventh point of fact, also extremely important, verse 4 states the two witnesses are entirely symbolic. Verbatim. John could not have made his reference any more clear to a biblically literate audience than he did. The eighth point of fact is that the explanation provided by Counter-Reformation rapture theology of this text is historically dated, medieval fantasy. Its explanations are both fantastical and implausible. And along with bottomless pits, Babylonian river demons, magic bugs, and flying people, they depend entirely on a belief paradigm of medieval magic and superstition. Their explanation today is patently out of touch with reality, and was originally composed in medieval Europe as an anti-Semitic violence fantasy against Jews, but is now being revised and used against Muslims. Neither of which, however, are the real target of this prophecy. In chapter 11 verses 1 through 13 there are 13 verses. Out of these 13 verses, there are 8 points of fact that objectively date this text hundreds of years ago in the past. At the very latest. That is over 60% of the text in the first prophecy in chapter 11. 60%. So it is really hard to simply miss seeing. You have to be a very determined individual to read a text and ignore 60% of what you see, in order to hold on to your preconceived notions. Or, you simply have to be dishonest. And as already explained in the videos on Revelation chapter 10, there is a clear dating reference in verse 2, which leaves the reader only two realistic dating options for the coming of the two witnesses. One is the Counter-Reformation futurist dating method of 134 AD, and the other is the historicist date of 1390 AD. And as you already saw, the historicist date of 1390 was absolutely clearly fulfilled in the previous events concerning the rise of John Wycliffe at Oxford, the coming of the modern Bible, the Lollard evangelism movement, and the Great Mandarin Storm, which they came out of. As counter-reformationists themselves already know, there is a volume of information in the first prophecy in chapter 11, from verses 1 through 13, that provide historically dated references. As you saw in chapter 9, historically dated material is material that makes references to customs, manners, military equipment, events or social structures that emerge or arise in a specific historical context. All you would have to do is be honest with yourself and know a little about history. And we find this in numerous references in chapter 11 as well. As you just saw with the 8 points of fact. This first fact is so conclusive on its own right, that there really is no need for the other 7 points. Because the text in verse 2 is simply that clear. John dates the beginning of events for the 7th trumpet 42 months or 1260 days after Jerusalem was given to the Gentiles, which we know was an historic event that occurred in 130 AD. With no gap between John's reference to that event and 1260 days later. And all this occurs after a rapture, as counter-reformationist ministers do, is only half the problem they have with this text. Because if you ignore John's reference to Jerusalem being given to the Gentiles, as the reference point, then you have to also insert a future period of time, when Jerusalem will be taken away from today's modern Jews, again, and given back to Gentiles, all over again. In order to recycle these prophecies, which is what they are doing, they have to reset all the conditions mentioned in the prophecy, which point to its original fulfillment. Meaning they have to recycle the events described as well. And if you are going to recycle chapter 11 to make it future, then you are also going to have to recycle Jerusalem being given to the Gentiles after 1948. So not only does the Counter-Reformation rapture scheme not fit the dating in this text, it doesn't fit the chronology of events either. So in other words, you simply have to ignore the text and focus on a few ink blot-free associations. Which is, of course, a dishonest way to handle these texts. The second point of reality check that is found in the text, in verse 8, is a reference to a very famous social custom. It is the practice of posthumous public humiliation by exposing the corpse of a deceased person to the elements. The mention of this social convention historically dates John's prophecy in the text in verse 8. Posthumous public humiliation by exposing the corpse of a deceased person is a very old and ancient social custom. But it is a social custom which is no longer practiced in most of the civilized world. That would be about 140 countries on Earth. And one of those countries is the country of modern Israel. The social custom is the custom of refusal of burial. It was common in the not-so-ancient world to refuse burial to people who were considered notorious enemies of the state, or who had terribly violated some social norm. The practice was conducted consistently throughout the Reformation, against people the Vatican considered heretics. In the case of John Wycliffe, after John of Gaunt was no longer around to protect him, the Vatican had his remains actually dug up from the grave, and burned, and then thrown into the river. But after the emergence of early modern science in the 1800s, early scientists discovered, and the world's leaders and governments became aware of the fact, that exposed rotting corpses could spread deadly disease throughout an entire region or even country. Infectious bacteria and viruses could be carried by maggot and fly infestations or mosquitoes, from rotting corpses, into the rest of an entire city or even country. So the people responsible for creating public humiliation by exposing corpses to the elements, such as the Vatican, decided that was no longer God's will, or in other words, no longer in their own self-interests. And public health departments, in modern countries passed laws, requiring the removal of exposed corpses, to places now called morgues, for the safety of everyone around them. The social custom of posthumous public humiliation, by exposing the corpse of a deceased person to the elements, is no longer in existence in Jerusalem. And thus, the time frame window for this prophecy has now come to an end, historically. And the scenario John describes in chapter 11 would have occurred sometime before this change in social convention, placing it objectively prior to the late 1800s. The issue of historical context is another very important key indicator for the time frame of texts in Scripture, and in particular the prophecies in the book of Revelation. Just as particular customs fade out in history, so do historical contexts, described in the surrounding textual material. And that is what we find in Revelation 11. The historical context for the famous verse in Revelation 11 verse 8, which describes the two witnesses being subjected to the custom of posthumous humiliation by corpse exposure, is also self-evident in the text. Why is that? Because in the description John gives, he describes a social setting not only where there is no city morgue, but also where there are no laws being violated concerning the removal of the bodies. There are no autopsies done on the corpses involved in a death from violence, and there are no municipal, state, or governmental regulatory legal procedures being suspended or violated by the actions being taken in the text. It is one thing when a custom is antiquated and no longer in use, but when the laws change, it means that the custom is no longer even possible, even when there is a desire by some individuals or parties to engage in it. It simply becomes, virtually, a non-existent possibility. And interpreting the text to mean this would imply not just the surface prophecy itself, but an extraordinary set of circumstances that make its occurrence possible, such as the complete absence of basic services and local government, as well. But it is clear that John makes no indications in the text that there is no local government. In fact, his indication is precisely the opposite in the text. The two witnesses offend local government, and thus the use of posthumous public humiliation, by corpse exposure, as retribution and punishment. John's description matches a social setting and a legal state, which no longer exists. It did at one time, as you saw in the previous section. But it does not exist today. And the absence of those medical and legal procedures from the text, once again, historically date this text prior to the latter part of the 1800s. The absence of current medical procedures and regulatory laws from the text rule out the possibility it has anything to do with the present day, or futuristic, scenario of events. To put it bluntly, it is the equivalent of reading a prophecy about America that says, quote, "They will cross the western frontier in covered wagons, and settle on the west coast." End quote. Such a prophecy would be immediately recognizable as a period of American history known as the westward expansion, because people no longer travel by covered wagons, and they have already settled on the west coast. So it is no longer possible to do that. And that is precisely what is written in Revelation chapter 11 verse 8. The use of morgues emerged in the middle 1800s, as did laws forbidding public exposure of corpses. Leaving bodies exposed to the elements to symbolize disapproval or protest of what they did or who they were when they were alive became no longer legal, including in Jerusalem, just as it is today. Neither Muslims or Jews, in modern Jerusalem, permit public exposure of corpses, regardless of who they are or how much they may be disliked. And this change in social custom, historically and objectively, marks the real target time frame for the prophecy John mentioned in chapter 11 verse 8, as sometime before the middle 1800s, when these customs were brought to an end. Today, if there were two literal prophets killed in the street, after a crime scene assessment had been conducted, their bodies would be taken, by law, to Jerusalem's city morgue. And it would be from inside a refrigeration drawer in a city morgue that they would have to resurrect back to life and ascend into heaven, not the streets in Jerusalem. So even if you wanted to completely ignore John's statement in verse 4 that this is symbolism, and just willfully and erroneously take John's prophecy as complete hyperliteralism, the prophecy today could not be fulfilled as John wrote it. The context of social conventions and customs, wherein this prophecy could have been fulfilled in Jerusalem, are no longer present, and cannot be fulfilled today. Muslims in Jerusalem would no more leave rotting corpses in the open street to rot than modern Jews. Muslims have their own services and protocols for processing the deceased as well, including something called the Red Crescent, which comes and picks up dead bodies and corpses in Muslim areas of Jerusalem. It might sound plausible to many people if such an activity was attributed to an extreme radical Muslim group, such as ISIS, but then you are stuck with explaining how they managed to take over Jerusalem from the Palestinians, who are much more inclined to side with the Iranian-backed terrorist group Hezbollah than ISIS. Iranian groups such as Hezbollah are aligned with Syria and are presently fighting ISIS. The fact is, historically speaking, posthumous humiliation through corpse exposure was not a Muslim practice under Sharia law. It was much more likely to be a practice under a Vatican state than an Islamic one, since not only did the Vatican have no prohibitions against the practice, they actually officially adopted its use in practice. But even in this, the practice was formally abolished after the discovery of germ theory in the 1800s, and since then, has no longer been practiced, even by the Vatican or any of its surrogate Western or Latin American states. Once again, the explanations from counter-reformationist, Rapture ministers, are not consistent with the facts, either concerning the use of posthumous public humiliation, or the practices of Islamic fundamentalists, under Sharia law. That lack of consistency with the facts, from both history and current laws, across the world, from Islamic Sharia law to modern Western democracies, even to modern Vatican states, demonstrate that counter-reformationists are intentionally violating the historical contexts of the prophecy in chapter 11, in order to artificially force its interpretation into modern society, and into the future, rather than the past, where it is clearly placed, in an historical context. But not only does the text in chapter 11 describe customs from the past, not only does it describe an historical context that is clearly in the past, chapter 11 even describes a natural disaster and its surrounding demographics in Jerusalem, that clearly place this text in history past, not in the future. Predicting there will be an earthquake in the Middle East is only slightly different than predicting there will be a hurricane in Miami, Florida, or a snowstorm in Buffalo, New York, given the geological history of the region. But John does not just predict an earthquake. He gives some details about this earthquake which set it apart from all the others. And these details, which he gives in verse 13, are important details concerning the identification of the fulfillment of this prophecy. If you ignore these details, then you will miss what he is prophesying. In verse 13 he writes, quote, "And the same hour was there a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell, and in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were frightened and gave glory to the God of heaven." End quote. This is a very odd text, for a number of reasons. The first thing that must be noted is that while John calls it a great earthquake, using the Greek term, megas, but his description of its damage is not that extensive, which seems a bit contradictory. But it is clear in John's text that he is pointing to its seismic rank as one of its distinguishing features, yet creating relatively little damage to the city. The modern city of Jerusalem is much bigger today than it has been in the past. Today the city of Jerusalem, with its population of nearly 1 million people, is 48 square miles and expanding. However, the city of Jerusalem, in the 1800s, was much smaller than it is today. For an earthquake to damage only 1/10 of the city, in the 1800s, would not place it into the annals of history as one of history's great earthquakes. And there have been much bigger earthquakes in the region, that have utterly flattened and annihilated entire cities, such as the one that occurred at Antioch, or such as recent earthquakes in Iran. But for an historical period, in the city of Jerusalem, John notes the strength of this earthquake is notable. Not only does he specify the extent of the damage as being 1/10 of the city, he also describes the number of casualties as being 7,000 people. The fact that he mentions these two details together, linking them, gives us an estimate of the population at the time of the earthquake in Jerusalem. If 7,000 were roughly 1/10 of the city, then the population would have to be somewhere around 70,000 at the time. And that certainly puts this earthquake out of range, in reference to modern-day Jerusalem. An earthquake today that destroyed 1/10 of Jerusalem would produce a casualty toll of 100,000 people, which is well beyond John's reference to 7,000. Jerusalem's population began to move far away from those metrics by the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. Today, these metrics are nowhere even relatable to one another. The third thing that is most odd about this prophecy is the reaction of the residents in the city of Jerusalem after the earthquake. Despite the fact it is relatively small given the history of earthquakes in the region, John describes the reaction of the people of Jerusalem as being in awe of what just happened. And they give glory to God. One thing that is definitely not a part of an earthquake's aftermath is people standing around giving glory to God. Most of the time they are in shock, and if anything, there are much more reactions of anger toward God than giving him glory, because he sent an earthquake on them. So this is a very odd description. It doesn't fit the normal scenario one would find in the aftermath of most normal earthquakes, large or small. So all this is very puzzling until you begin to research the history of earthquakes in Jerusalem before the end of the 1800s, which from the historical contexts, we know these descriptions must be placed. If we do that, then all of a sudden we will find exactly such an earthquake as John describes. And it literally matches these very details given in John's text. It damaged only about 1/10 of the city. There were roughly 7,000 deaths. The people were completely freaked out by the odd timing of its occurrence, and they were frightened and gave glory to God. Which is a very bizarre reaction to an earthquake. But it didn't happen at the end of the world. And it certainly is not something still future. And we will explain more about this earthquake when we discuss the historical fulfillment of these texts. But here it must be noted, given John's actual description mentioning the size of the quake, the reaction of the people, and the size of the population at the time, this was also another indication in John's text of a real historical context and a real event which occurred on the historical timeline in the history of Jerusalem. Not something future at the end of the world. When you get to Revelation 11, you will hear counter-reformationists swear there is a prophecy about your TV set in this text. Of course, there is not a single statement to that effect, but nevertheless, they will claim there is one there. The reason they will turn Revelation chapter 11 into a prophecy about TV sets is because they do not want to admit what is in the text. And so, they must hide what is there, with the explanation there is a TV set at the center of the prophecy in Revelation 11. Because, without a TV set, they will explain, this prophecy could never be fulfilled, thus, it must be a prophecy about your high-definition, Sony LCD, color TV set. Isn't it amazing that John would prophesy about your TV set? Of course, what is really miraculous is that after 1/3 of the Earth has been blown off by a cosmic asteroid, and on the 2/3 that remain there has already been a global nuclear holocaust in chapter 9, still, all the TV sets are somehow all, still, miraculously working, with no electricity, giving full coverage of events in Jerusalem, despite no one on Earth having any electricity. Because the global nuclear war in chapter 9 would have already fried every electrical grid on the planet, not to mention the cataclysmic asteroid that blew off 1/3 of the Earth down to its planetary core. If that all sounds ridiculous, that would be because it is. And while your TV set is certainly an enjoyable modern invention, and has definitely played an important role in history, it's simply not mentioned in Revelation chapter 11. In any way. Fact number 5 that is found in the text is a reference to historically dated demographics concerning the city of Jerusalem. As already mentioned, the population grows vastly out of range for the population density mentioned in the text as 7,000, representing somewhere close to 10% of the city of Jerusalem after the beginning of the 1900s. But that is not the only problem Counter-Reformation theology is presented with in the demographics of Jerusalem described in the text. There is another, quite serious problem they are faced with. Because John not only describes a numeric range for the population of Jerusalem at the intended time of his prophecy, he also describes its demographic breakdown, in terms of nationality and ethnicity. And this is, once again, a key indicator about the time frame of the prophecy. In verse 9 John describes the residents of the people of Jerusalem as follows, quote, "And they, of the people and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves." End quote. And where is this? This is in Jerusalem. And the text is referring to the people of Jerusalem. Counter-Reformationists take this text and bogusly claim it refers to modern television. How else could people and kindreds and tongues and nations see their dead bodies? The only problem with that claim is that John is describing the residents of the city of Jerusalem. The Counter-Reformation knows that their reference to modern television is as ridiculous an explanation for this text as magic bugs are in chapter 9. But they also know that their sympathetic audiences are simply not that conscientious about what they read in the Bible, and would never question their authoritatively given explanations. But Counter-Reformationists, who offer this excuse, know themselves, it is a patently false claim. There is no prophecy of modern television coverage in this text. There is, however, something else they don't want people actually seeing. Something very important they need to hide and cover up that is very clearly in the text, without any insinuations or innuendos. In verse 2 he specifically mentions Jerusalem, saying, quote, "The holy city shall they tread underfoot." End quote. What group, which he refers to as they, is he talking about? Earlier in the same verse he says, quote, "It is given to the Gentiles," end quote. So these are Gentiles in the city of Jerusalem who are the people of different kindreds, tongues, and nations. It's that simple. In verse 10, the text says that, quote, "These prophets tormented them that dwelt on the earth," end quote. But as you have seen throughout this video series, the word translated as earth in the KJV and many other translations is an intentionally false translation. The word is simply, generically, the word land, as you clearly see in the Greek text. So the text says in verse 10 that these prophets tormented the people who dwelt in the land. Well, what land is John talking about? It is the same land he is discussing being trodden underfoot by the Gentiles. These two prophets torment the Gentiles that dwell in the land. At no point in John's writing yet has he ever made the transition from Israel being destroyed, and 144,000 martyrs being slain, and Israel returning to a Jewish residency yet. He has clearly described its destruction, the death of 144,000 believing Jews in the Roman-sponsored genocides, and now he begins the chapter with noting it would be, quote, "given to the Gentiles to tread underfoot," end quote. These are the Gentiles treading it underfoot, precisely as he began the chapter with. And after a prophetic period of 42 months, in the same way Daniel prophesied 70 weeks being 490 years, he says the two witnesses come, after the coming of a book. A book which you saw in chapter 10, was the Bible. And then the two witnesses torment the residents of Jerusalem, and those who dwell on the land. Those who he describes as Gentiles and coming from many other tongues and nations. The counter-reformationists do not want you to see what that text is actually referring to, thus the very lame excuses about modern TV sets. There is a very big problem for counter-reformationists and their theology in this text, because in their chronology, they have claimed that Jews have all come back to Israel already, and the rapture has occurred, and these two witnesses are coming to torment the non-Christian atheists, Muslims and Jews. But the problem is, as you have already seen, there is no rapture. There is no gap in John's dating timeline, and here in chapter 11, there is a majority Gentile population dwelling in the land, who are still treading it underfoot, who are confronted by the two witnesses. Two witnesses whom the Gentiles, who are dwelling in the land, do not like. Gentiles, who exercise the antiquated, but now illegal Western practice of posthumous public humiliation with their corpses as part of their punishment in the streets of Jerusalem. That clearly places the time frame for John's prophecy on the historical timeline at a certain point in history. If you look up the demographic history of Jerusalem, you will notice a very important change in its demographics, historically. The chart on your screen is a chart of the historical demographics of the region of the Middle East called Judea in Roman times, later called Palestine, and today called Israel. It shows, after its destruction by Rome, as of the year 1517 up to the year 1882, the Jewish population was still insignificant in this area, compared to the Gentile population. But the Jewish population indicated by the blue bars gradually increases until the years 1946 to 1948, and then all of a sudden, the dominant color bar changes, and the blue bars go dramatically up over the years, and the red bars dip and then consistently represent less than a third, over the decades. Showing the Gentile population in Israel becoming a minority only. This graph shows the close of the time frame window for Revelation chapter 11 verse 9. And it shows that after the year 1946, the prophecy in Revelation can no longer be fulfilled demographically. Meaning it had to occur sometime prior in history to 1948. And that is precisely what counter-reformationists do not want anyone to know when they read Revelation 11. Because if you know that, then you will know the Antichrist has already come in history, and is not future at all. Meaning you will also become acutely aware of what and who the real biblical Antichrist actually is. And it will come as no surprise whatsoever to any Protestant with any real knowledge of history. And that is what they intentionally hide behind their bogus explanations of modern TV in Revelation chapter 11 verse 9. The demographics John describes in his prophecy date this event is occurring in history sometime before 1948. And that is a factually objective, mathematically and statistically based observation. Thus why the public is told to think TV sets instead. There is an old saying that says, "The dragon guards the treasure." The New International Standard Version Bible is a notoriously counter-reformation translation of the Bible. It will intentionally completely deviate from the text to provide the reader a patently devised substitution for the actual text in the original languages, literally taking liberties to change entire words and sentences. But the NIV is still a very valuable study tool. Why is that? Because whenever you want to see exactly what the Counter-Reformation is trying to hide in a text, all you have to do is first look up the Greek transliteration and compare it to the translation in the NIV, and it will very clearly show you what the Counter-Reformation is trying to intentionally hide from the public in the text. If you are working so hard as to just literally and completely deviate from the text in order to hide something, you cannot claim afterwards you never knew it was there, or didn't see it. You first saw it, determined how it was unprofitable, and then changed the translation to avoid the loss. It was a deliberate action. And that is precisely what we find again in the famous verse about fire coming out of the mouths of the two witnesses in Revelation chapter 11 verse 5. You can find illustrations of the Counter-Reformation's explanation of this text all over the internet today. They show two prophet-like looking people with fire coming out of their mouths, precisely as the text is explained by Counter-Reformation theology. And when you read the New International Standard Version translation of this text, that is precisely what you will read the text saying. There is a very big problem with all this, however. And it is a problem no one who has bothered to look this text up, in either commentaries or the Greek text, or even in a comparison with the KJV text, can avoid seeing. That is simply not how the text is actually written. What's the big problem? It doesn't say fire will come out of the mouths, plural, of the two witnesses. What it says is that fire will come out of the mouth, singular, of the two witnesses, plural. And that is a much different statement, because it doesn't work as a literalism. And thus the change by the NIV. Why did they do that, and what difference does it make? There is unfortunately a big difference, and the reason the NIV did that is because the NIV translators felt it was their duty to erase an important Hebrew idiomatic expression. This expression is found in the Torah, in Deuteronomy 17:6 and 19:15, and in the New Testament quoted by Christ in Matthew 18:16. And the same idiomatic expression is quoted also by Paul, in 2 Corinthians 13:1. What makes it an idiomatic expression rather than a literalism? The reason it is called an idiomatic expression is because it is an expression that is grammatically incorrect, as you will see it originally used in the Torah. In Deuteronomy 17:6, quote, "At the mouth of two witnesses, or three witnesses, shall he that is worthy of death be put to death, but at the mouth of one witness, he shall not be put to death." End quote. There you see the use of mouth, singular, and witnesses, plural. In Deuteronomy 19:15 it reads, quote, "One witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity, or for any sin, in any sin that he sinneth. At the mouth of two witnesses, or at the mouth of three witnesses, shall the matter be established." Once again, you see the use of mouth, singular, with witnesses, plural. Grammatically speaking, the word mouth should be plural as well, so that the plural number of witnesses agrees with the plural number of mouths. But the expression is idiomatic, meaning it is a culturally unique expression to usage in the Hebrew language. Meaning if someone read this statement from another linguistic background, they would be seeing a grammatical mistake and have no knowledge of the idiomatic use. But we find this concept from Torah law cited in the New Testament by both Christ and the apostles, and they repeat the Hebrew idiomatic expression. In Matthew 18:16 Christ states, quote, "But if he will not hear thee, then take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of two or three witnesses every word may be established." End quote. Here again, we see mouth, singular used with witnesses, plural. And the Apostle Paul cites the same expression in 2 Corinthians 13:1. Quote, "This is the third time I am coming to you." In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every word be established. Again, we see mouth, singular, with witnesses, plural. Most people have enough common sense to understand this idiomatic expression without any real confusion, despite the odd contradiction in grammatical number between witnesses, plural, and mouth, singular. But the presence of this idiomatic expression from Hebrew is important. Secular scholars today like to point out that the author of Revelation was Jewish, which comes as no surprise to biblically literate people. But they point this out as though this was somehow an unusual thing from the rest of the New Testament. And they do this because of the use of Hebrew idiomatic expressions in the text, which have been pointed out in previous chapters. But the only problem with their observation and conclusion is that the use of Hebrew idiomatic expressions are not just found in the book of Revelation, they are found throughout the entire New Testament as well. Yet somehow, they are not as quick to point out in the other books. The authors are Jewish as well. And the only reason you would be using Hebrew idiomatic expressions as an author is because the audience you are writing them to are Hebrews as well, and understand the meaning of those expressions. Just as you saw in Matthew and in 2 Corinthians. The NIV completely erases this idiomatic expression, beginning in the Torah itself, where they rewrite the text in Deuteronomy 17:6 as quote, "Based on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, they must surely die. But they are not to die based on the testimony of one person." End quote. As you can see, the Hebrew idiomatic expression of mouth, singular, with witnesses, plural, has been completely erased. The same thing is done in Deuteronomy 19:15, where the NIV reads as follows, quote, "The testimony of one person alone is not to suffice to convict anyone of any iniquity, sin, or guilt. But the matter will stand on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses." End quote. Once again, the NIV completely erases the Hebrew idiomatic expression. When we get to the very words of Christ, in red ink, in Matthew 18:16, the NIV does the very same thing again. Quote, "But if he doesn't listen, take 1 or 2 others with you so that every word may be confirmed by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses." End quote. And so, even in regard to the words of Christ, the NIV does not mind using Christ as a Gentile sock puppet and sticking words in his mouth he never said. And naturally, if they would do that with Christ, they certainly wouldn't mind doing it with Paul. And so in 2 Corinthians, we see the NIV do the same thing. So at least they are consistently erasing the text throughout the whole entire Bible. But why is it so important to get rid of that Hebrew idiomatic expression? Well, for one, counter-reformationists do not want people to realize the Bible is actually Hebrew, as is the religion it is describing on its pages. And secondly, it is fairly clear they do not want what is written in Revelation 11:5 interpreted as an Hebrew idiomatic expression, because it would collapse their prophetic hyperliteralism. So they simply erase the expression completely throughout their translation of the entire Bible. So when you come to Revelation 11:5 and read mouths instead of mouth, you will have no idea what you have read is actually a lie, a misrepresentation of what the text actually says. And so, that is why the New International Standard Version simply removes the problem by hiding it and masking it over in their translation. The problem is, while it does say 2 witnesses, plural, it says mouth, singular. And this is not an expression, as you see elsewhere, of speaking with one voice. It is literally one physical mouth. When the Greek New Testament wanted to point out 2 or more people saying the same thing, they used the expression, speaking with one voice, as you will find used in Acts chapter 19 verse 34. Quote, "But when they knew that he was a Jew, all with one voice about the space of 2 hours cried out, 'Great is Diana of the Ephesians.'" End quote. The reason the proper expression is one voice and not one mouth, is that the mouths are plural, but what they are saying, the sound they make, is the same sound. The Greek word voice is phone, from which we get our word phonograph, or telephone. It is a reference to sound. One sound from many mouths. Not one mouth, but one sound. But what we find in Revelation 11:5 is one mouth. 2 witnesses with only one mouth. Meaning if you take the text literally, it is describing a Siamese twin. 2 bodies that have only one mouth between them, that they both speak from. Or in this case that fire comes out of. This singular reference to one mouth is an astounding detail about what John was really describing. It is such an astounding detail, no one could miss the connection. And there is no way that that connection could be simply a random coincidence. John did not make a grammatical mistake in the choice of making his reference to the mouth singular, while his reference to the two witnesses are plural. He gives a very specific, unmistakable detail that no one could honestly miss. So naturally, the counter-reformationists in their translation hide the reference and show the text saying, mouths, plural. But when the NIV switched that word, mouth, from singular to plural, they did that knowing that the Greek text is very explicitly in the singular number. They made a conscious choice to actually hide that from their readers. And the NIV consistently hides these kinds of Greek expressions when it benefits reinforcing the theological bias of counter-reformation theology in its readers. So what is the truth about all this? What was John referring to in the singular use of the word, mouth? What is the NIV trying to hide from its readers? The answer to this mystery is very simple. If you recall, John said the key to understanding the mystery of his book in chapter 1 verse 20 was to remember while you read it, that quote, "The mystery of the 7 stars which thou sawest in my right hand, and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are the messengers of the 7 ecclesia, and the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 ecclesia." End quote. And John has remained consistent throughout the entire book, making reference to astronomical events and data in the heavens to mark the time frames for his prophecies and explain what he is describing in them. In chapter 10, you saw that the rainbow angel was the forerunner of the coming of the two witnesses. And you remember that the rainbow angel was John's reference to Saturn over Orion. It is no accident that if you look at a star map, the constellation which comes immediately after Orion is called the constellation Gemini. But Gemini was the reference to 2 Greek gods, and John is not using the Greek astronomical system. He is replacing it with his own definitions for these constellations, just as he did in his reference to Orion. And instead of referring to the constellation Gemini, he refers to them as the two witnesses. How do you know this? Because there is a very specific detail about the constellation Gemini that matches John's text with such detailed precision and accuracy, it goes way beyond anything even remotely plausible as simply a parallel coincidence. It also explains in part why John insists on using that specific and familiar Hebrew idiomatic expression from the Torah and his prophecy concerning the astronomical dating for his prophecy. The same idiomatic expression the NIV has tried to completely erase from their biblical translation. The constellation Gemini, which you see on your screen, is outlined by the stars showing 2 figures. These 2 figures are supposed to be Castor and Pollux. The figure on the right side is Castor. If you will notice, there is a star marking the top of his head, and then there are 3 stars below it. 1 star marking his left shoulder, and the 2nd star marking the point where his neck and shoulder meet, and then a 3rd star marking his arm. There is no star in the vicinity of his mouth. It is blank. However, if you look at the figure on the left side, there is 1 star over his left eye, and then if you look below that there are 2 stars. 1 marking his left shoulder, and the other star on the vicinity of his mouth. So of the 2 figures, only 1 figure has a star located on his mouth. There is only 1 mouth star in Gemini, even though there are 2 figures. Just as John's text reads in Revelation chapter 11 verse 5. But that's not all. Here is what is absolutely amazing about that mouth star. It was discovered by an astronomer named John Russell Hind during the time of Queen Victoria, in the mid-1800s, the same exact time frame that the prophecy about the earthquake seems to be targeting based on demographics and seismology. The name of the star is Geminorum. But here is what is amazing about this star. It is called the cataclysmic variable star. It is described by this terminology because cataclysmic variable stars are, quote, stars which irregularly increase in brightness by a large factor, then drop back down to a quiescent state. They were initially called novae, from the Latin word for new. Since ones with an outburst, HE brightness visible to the naked eye, and an invisible quiescent brightness, appeared as new stars in the sky. End quote. The outbursts of U Geminorum is caused because it is a binary star, meaning there are two stars interacting with and rotating one another, in keeping with the pattern of two, as in two witnesses. The time of their brightness, when they are visible to the naked eye, are called outbursts. When U Geminorum is having an outburst, it glows red, like fire. So it is not seen most of the time, but when it is, it increases in magnitude 100-fold and glows red, like fire. And this phenomena is called an outburst. And it is the mouth star Pollux in Gemini. If all that were not amazing enough already, there is something even more amazing about this star. Remember that John stated in chapter 1 verse 20 that the 7 stars, a reference to the 7 planets, were the messengers. One of these planets has the same red color in it in the sky as we find with U Geminorum. That planet is the planet Mars. The red fiery color of Mars is why the ancient world associated this planet with anger and war. Normally, the planetary orbit of Mars passes below this star. But there is something known as retrograde motion in the sky, due to the spin of the Earth on its axis. And ironically, it occurs every 2 years with Mars. And once again, we see the theme of 2 popping up again. But the retrograde motion of Mars is always different when it occurs. The motion is different because of its position in the sky, its location is always different because of precession, and the constellation it occurs in is always different because of the circuit of Mars through the 360 degrees of the sky. But there was one point in time when Mars, the glowing red planet, passes over the mouth of Gemini, the binary cataclysmic, variable glowing red star of U Geminorum, while it is having an outburst, glowing red, and here is what it looked like. It looks exactly like fire coming out of the mouth, singular, of the 2 witnesses, plural. Exactly as John describes in his text. The occurrence of this event in history marks the beginning of John's prophecy in chapter 11, which we will get into in the next video. But it is sufficient to note here that the 2 witnesses John is describing in his narrative are the constellation Gemini, and the fire coming from their mouth singular, which is the star U Geminorum, is Mars crossing U Geminorum in retrograde, which actually occurred at a unique and specific time in history. What you now see on your screen is what John was referring to as the 2 witnesses. And you are now looking at fire coming out of the mouth, singular, of the 2 witnesses, plural. Precisely as John wrote. And why did he call them witnesses? In Torah law, it was a requirement that a legal fact be established by 2 witnesses. In chapter 10, the rainbow angel, which was Orion, had his hand lifted to heaven and had sworn an oath to the living God that Chronos should be no more. Right behind Orion comes Gemini. And these are the 2 witnesses of that oath. And this is seen in the language of the text at the beginning of chapter 11, because the text is continuing from chapter 10, when this same angel tells him to eat the book. Right after the text at the end of chapter 10, the same angel, who is still talking to John, says, quote, "I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy." End quote. He calls them, quote, my 2 witnesses. In the Greek text, it literally reads, the 2 witnesses of me. Why were they called the 2 witnesses of the rainbow angel? Well, what did they witness? They witnessed him swearing an oath to heaven that Chronos should be no more. And that is why he calls them his witnesses. That is what they witnessed. They witnessed his oath that Chronos should be no more. All that detail is intentionally left out by counter-reformationist preachers, because they do not want you to know Chronos was even mentioned in the text at all. Much less an angel swearing an oath to end him. Much less 2 witnesses who bore witness to that oath. So you see, This text about the two witnesses in chapter 11 is actually all based on what has happened in the previous chapter in chapter 10. The coming of the book. The angel's oath to heaven that Chronos should be no more, and the coming of the two witnesses who witnessed the angel's oath to heaven. And that brings us to fact number 7. The fact is, John overtly states in verse 4 that his narrative of the two witnesses is to be understood as symbolism. And it is the symbolism of the two witnesses in the narrative which constitute what he is actually prophesying will happen in history, in chapter 11. There are possibly thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of charismatics running around today, trying to get visions and revelations about the identity of two literal witnesses, predicted in the Counter-Reformation eschatology scheme. And one of the reasons they refuse to give up the deception that Counter-Reformation theology has victimized them with, is that they feel God has spoken to them directly that they have some role to play in this imaginary end-time drama. Or perhaps they even imagine that they have been told they are one of these two witnesses, themselves. Most of the time, this claim is simply delusional. But not always. There could in fact be some truth to what they have actually heard. Another aspect of biblical spiritual experience was often being compared to a character in biblical text. If a person is called to a ministry in reference to the two witnesses, then it would be logical that if it were a real calling, they would at least know who, or even what, the two witnesses really were. Or what the two witnesses actually witnessed. Or at the very least, know their purpose was to bear witness of the oath of the rainbow angel that Chronos should be no more. If they don't even know Chronos should be no more, then it would be rather impossible to have anything to do with the real meaning of the two witnesses, spiritually. Since that is their actual mission. But despite everything that is in the text, contrary to Counter-Reformation theology, from the time frame in verse 2, to the demographics in verse 2 and 9, there will be people who will insist that they got told by God personally, they are either one of the two witnesses, or they are supposed to aid and assist, or bear witness of them, somehow. But if there is absolutely nothing, you have already seen, that will penetrate a person's stubbornness to be right, without, or even despite, the actual facts, it is that John himself in his own writing, tells his readers what he is talking about, when he is talking about, quote, the two witnesses. End quote. You do not have to have a mystical revelation to get their names, or find out when they are coming, or who they really are. Because John answers those questions in the text in the most obvious, and simplest way possible. He point blank, verbatim, and explicitly tells his readers, who they are. They are, John says, two trees and two lampstands. He doesn't say they are like two trees and two lampstands. He uses the Greek emphatic expression, saying, point blank, these are. Not these are like. Not these are similar to. Not these are figures of. He says point blank, and emphatically, these are. So if John is telling what these are, why are you trying to get a special mystical revelation of who they are, when John has already, in the very text that he describes them in, says openly and factually, these are. Not these are like. Not these are figures of. But. These are. And what he says they are two trees, and two lampstands. And obviously they cannot be both, literally. They would have to be a tree or a lampstand literally. But he says they are two trees and two lampstands, at the very same time, they are two witnesses. And he also says, they are standing before the God of the land, translated earth. And the word in the expression, are, as in his statement, these are. That word is in the present tense. Not the future tense. Meaning, they are, when John is writing. They already are. Not they will be. They will someday become. But they are, right now, 95 AD. They already are. In the present tense. In John's day. Which means if you were one of those witnesses, literally, you must be very old by now. Actually, you would be exactly 1,923 years old, this year. That would make you the oldest living person on earth. But when John states these things, about who are the two witnesses, he's not offering a suggestion for you to go pray about. He is not giving you just a clue, or a hint, for you to contort and to scramble, as some try to suggest. He is telling you what he is talking about. And if you refuse to read what he wrote about them, then why bother talking about the subject at all? Just go and make your own stuff up, and say it is your own. But if you want to use John's label and his reference about two witnesses, then you are stuck with the fact he has already told you who they are, in his own text, and he has told you they exist in his own day when he is writing about them. Which means, they are not two literal people. They are two trees and two lampstands, and were in existence standing before God 1900 years ago, when John wrote. So you see why that is clearly a constellation, and not two literal people. Secondly, he is echoing a text from the Old Testament. The text comes from Zechariah chapter 4 verse 3. Zechariah is awakened by an angel, and he has a vision, and sees two olive trees producing oil, draining into a bowl, which feeds the lampstand in the temple. There is only one problem with that reference. It is entirely symbolic. There were no olive trees that did that. It was entirely symbolism in a vision that Zechariah was having. The meaning of the symbolism was explained by the angel and summarized in the statement, "Not by might or by power, but by my spirit says the Lord." It was a recusal of violence and force. And so even in this reference, invoked by John, what John is really talking about, is precisely and exactly opposite of the violence and force, depicted by two fire-breathing prophets, running around Jerusalem, killing people with their flame-throwing breath. Exactly and precisely, the opposite. That is why John makes the connection to what he is about to write. Not by might or by power, but by my spirit says the Lord. And the two witnesses John is talking about, are those two olive trees that feed the lamp of the true spiritual temple of God. And naturally, if you look at Gemini in the sky, it does look like two trees, standing side by side, with a star in the top of the middle, symbolizing the bowl and into which the oil drains into. Gemini is highest in the sky in January, and it is not without coincidence that Hanukkah occurs from November to January, depending on the rotation of the months, which you will see more about this connection in just a minute. When it comes to the two candlesticks, sometimes translated as lampstands, that is another very interesting allusion by John. Depending on which temple you are talking about, there were different numbers of lampstands. In the tabernacle, there was only one. Later in Solomon's temple there were 10. 5 on the right and 5 on the left. If you look at Gemini in the visible sky, there are 5 main stars on the right and 5 main stars on the left. But John doesn't say 10, he says only 2. And the word for candlestick is the same word used for lampstand. So what was John talking about? If there never were 2 lampstands in any of the temples, nor 2 candlesticks, where did John get that from? And what did he mean by it? Counter-Reformationists do their usual routine on this reference to 2 candlesticks and treat it as another ink blot for free association. They imagine it means their church. They imagine it means their leaders. They imagine it means Jews and Gentiles. They imagine it means all kinds of things, but they can never tell you what John was making reference to, because it is the only place in the entire scriptures where this description is used. Nowhere else does any biblical author refer to 2 candlesticks or 2 lampstands. Nowhere. So that is why counter-reformationists just fill in the blank with whatever pops into their heads, rather than admit the obvious. If you go looking for 2 candlesticks or 2 lampstands in the various temples and tabernacles, you will find no such thing. There is only one place, and one place only, where you are going to find 2 candlesticks. That is the 2 candles, used by Jews for generations, to mark the beginning of every Sabbath. If you research this practice, you will be told in some sources, it did not begin until the Middle Ages. But the people who codified the practice in the Middle Ages, claimed it was an ancient practice, and came from obeying the Torah that no fire should be lit on the Sabbath. So the 2 candles were lit before the beginning of every Sabbath. Any light or heat requiring a fire, were taken from the Sabbath candles, instead, thus avoiding the act of lighting a fire. The symbolism of the 2 Sabbath candles also represented 2 divine witnesses that the Sabbath was being kept in the home, as commanded. The Sabbath candles also make much more sense in regard to John's reference to Zechariah 4 verse 3, and his statement, "Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord." That is a reference to being still, and waiting on God himself, to move. Not the exertion of human force and violence, but its exact opposite. If you don't like that reference, for some reason, that is simply too bad. That is the only place you will find two candlesticks. And despite knowing that, that is the only thing Christian commentators will intentionally never mention. Ever. Instead they stick literally anything else they can think of, no matter how stretched and contorted it becomes, besides that obvious reference, into that blank. Because they don't want Christians failing to observe Constantine's venerable Day of the Sun, that he simply created out of thin air, in honor of Apollo. And as you will see in the next video, there is a very good reason these two candlesticks marking the Sabbath would be mentioned by John, who is still completely and thoroughly Jewish, as you have seen in the previous videos. And his reference to the two candlesticks that initiate the keeping of the Sabbath make that point even more unavoidably pronounced. And certainly, when you physically look at Gemini in the sky, it obviously looks much more like two candlesticks than it does two menorah lampstands. All this demonstrates, however, from the two olive trees to the two candlesticks, that John was discussing symbolism, not literalism, in his description of these two witnesses. His description was intended to be understood as a symbolism only, intended to point out a spiritual truth, which was designed to play a prominent role in understanding his prophecy in chapter 11. Not literalism, describing two physical, fire-breathing prophets walking through the streets of Jerusalem, hurling curses and judgments, and consuming in bodily physical fire all its non-Christian residents. In fact, his statement that they were the two olive trees and the two candlesticks were to point out precisely the exact opposite of how the Counter-Reformation describes them in their hyperliteralistic disregard of the actual text in chapter 11. There is something else, however, a little more revealing, that explains why church clergy commentators will never mention what John is really talking about when he refers to the two Sabbath candles. You saw that when John invokes the two olive trees, he is referring to a never-ending temple menorah that is filled with oil continuously. And then he mentions the two Sabbath candles. And he says that is what the two witnesses are. They are these two things. But when you go to find when the temple menorah with never-ending oil and two Sabbath candles are found together in Judaism, you will find it comes directly from Hanukkah, a memorial in Judaism that stands in direct contrast to the abomination of desolation that occurred on December 25, 167 BC, committed by Antiochus Epiphanes. And as you have already seen, John mentions this because this is what the witnesses are supposed to be witnessing about, that the rainbow angel of chapter 10 swore an oath to heaven saying, Chronos should be no more. The celebration of Chronos that we call Christmas today. So you see why Christmas celebrating charismatics, who think they have been told something about the two witnesses, or are actually one of the two witnesses themselves, are truly and tragically, simply delusional. They have been simply deluded by Counter-Reformation theology, which is built squarely on intentional deceit and a lying spirit. A lying spirit they have now internalized in the midst of their very own spiritual experiences. Internalizing it in such a way that can never be repented of without assailing their conception of God. And that is a very dangerous place to be spiritually, for anyone. It is literally defining God and Satan, completely opposite of what they really are, based on the scriptures. And that brings us to fact number 8. Even if you still disregard everything you have just heard, if you did nothing more than simply use your own brain to think for just one moment what a literal, physical, fire-breathing human would require in their biology and chemistry, the whole idea will become immediately recognizable for what it is. Another vain and empty appeal, in Counter-Reformation theology, to nothing more than medieval magic from the Dark Ages. It is not even remotely realistic on any level. Never mind the fact, it is not even what the text actually says in Revelation. Ask yourself the question, which is more probable, that there will be two literal men in Jerusalem, who will walk around for 3 years, randomly burning people to death in broad daylight, by breathing fire out of their mouths, completely unopposed by the police or SWAT teams. Or Someone has misinterpreted a text? Which do you really think is realistically more likely? The Counter-Reformation has been plagued by medieval superstition since its origins. For every one apparent miracle they read in the Bible, they add 10 more to it, through their church traditions, until their entire explanation not only becomes ridiculously false, they become incredulous, except to the most naive or deceitful. Counter-Reformation Rapture theology follows in this tradition by concocting ridiculously false explanations for everything in the book of Revelation, and then when confronted with the credulity of their explanations, they cite, in defense of their lies, miracles in the Bible. As though that gives them the license, just to invent 1,000 more, 10 times more ridiculous and fantastic. Most miracles in the Bible can be explained not as a violation of the laws of nature, but by the understanding of them as applied to a narrative in biblical text, and how they would work to fulfill the scenario described. The word miracle is a Latin term, and implies a suspension or a violation of the laws of nature. The Hebrew mind, however, did not think like that. The God of the Scriptures was not a God that went around violating his own laws. Instead, he was one that used those very laws to accomplish what are called signs and wonders. Signs and wonders, however, are a different concept than miracles. When Moses crossed the Red Sea, there is something in nature that causes events, precisely as they were described in the text. Today we call them tsunamis. The familiar retreat of the waters, followed by a deluge that drowns. Knowing it was going to happen beforehand, however, is called the prophetic. When the walls of Jericho fell, there was something in nature that fulfilled that description in the text. It is called an earthquake. Knowing it was going to happen beforehand is called the prophetic. When Elijah called fire down from heaven, there was something in nature that fulfilled the description given in the text. It is called lightning. Knowing it was going to happen beforehand is called the prophetic. These examples could go on and on throughout the entire Bible. But when the Counter-Reformation reads of such an event, they add and add and add and add to it, through their false church traditions, until the explanation of the original real event itself becomes highly suspect except to the most naive or callous-minded. And this is what they have done with their interpretation of Revelation. They have contorted the texts into ridiculous, fantastical explanations that no one conscious of any amount of common sense or reason would ever believe any of it. Because they do not speak of events which relate to nature in an unusual way, so as to describe a sign or a wonder. They use their explanations to invalidate and violate every aspect of reality known to mankind. Fantastical explanations that violate the very nature of reality, and are intrinsically disproven by it. This, the Reformers called superstition, because they were baseless, incredulous, fantastical claims, completely without any real merit in biblical text. And that is both an accurate and a precise description of Counter-Reformation's rapture theology on the book of Revelation. And once again, with respect to their descriptions of 2 fire-breathing prophets that randomly burn people alive in Jerusalem. Not only would 2 public murders like that be immediately stopped by the police, anti-terrorist SWAT teams, or even the military if necessary, the biological and chemical modifications on their physical biology necessary for such a feat would render them so unusual they would no longer qualify as even being human. First, they would have to have within their gastrointestinal system a liquid which would be capable of combustion and yet not kill them. So they would have to drink a belly full of gasoline or jet fuel without it killing them. And of course the only way you can do that is modify the gastrointestinal system so significantly, it no longer resembles a human biology. And even if such dramatic biological changes could be accomplished without killing them, if anyone shot them, or perhaps struck them, it could spark an explosion. And their bodies would instantly explode, like bombs. And even if you could get the combustible fuel into their bellies without killing them, creating enough of a pressure to stream the liquid out, as a jet stream of esophageal gas, would require extreme modifications to their throats and stomachs, way beyond the capability of human biology. And all that is simply for starters. The more combustible a fluid, the more toxic it becomes. With the exception of oxygen, hydrogen or nitrogen. But in order to get oxygen, hydrogen or nitrogen into a liquid form, the temperature must be so low it would instantly freeze human flesh to such a low temperature it would become brittle as glass and easily break. There is simply no biology which permits the existence of fire-breathing prophets. And there is no society on Earth where two such creatures could freely wander the streets of any city for 3 years without being cut down by modern militaries with machine guns, rockets, bombs, cruise missiles and chemical weapons. It is not a logistically feasible explanation to such an extreme. It can only be described as a superstition. Completely beside the point, it is without any basis in the real biblical text itself. So there is no point whatsoever in believing in it, unless you just simply want to deceive yourself about what the Antichrist really is. And that is simply really how determined you are to keep yourself entirely deceived in order to do it. And this is apparently, and precisely, what many people today, who call themselves Christians, have done to themselves. And that is precisely why 2 Thessalonians refers to it as a great delusion. Are you a Christian who has been victimized by this delusion? If you are, it is not too late to repent today. Repent simply means to change your mind. And that is all you have to do. It's just that simple. In this video, you have seen that Counter-Reformation theology's explanation of the two witnesses is not really biblical, nor is it realistic. And the text from the scriptures, from which it is taken, contains dated historical material that places the events of that text before the end of the 1800s. You have also seen how the actual reference to the two witnesses was a continuation of John's astronomical dating for his prophecies in the book of Revelation, using a rare astronomical event in the constellation Gemini, which he redefines as the two olive trees of Zechariah 4 and its never-ending menorah, the two candlesticks of the Sabbath, and the two witnesses of the oath to heaven. Chronos should be no more. In the next video, we will look at the actual timeline John has created for Revelation chapter 11 both in the text and in his astronomical dating. Then we will go through the first prophecy in chapter 11, verses 1 through 13, verse by verse, looking closely at the text to see exactly what he was really prophesying. Then we will compare those events to history to see if they occurred, and if so, how they were fulfilled. Thank you for watching.